Thank you very much for the warm welcome, especially for saying how young I seem. And thank you all for being here, and to the Down Syndrome Research Foundation for inviting me. I've never been to Vancouver before, and it seems beautiful so far, although I've only been here for about 12 hours. So today I'm here to talk about behavior in Down syndrome. Anytime I do this, it's a full house. I certainly try and do my best, and I think I know, a fair amount about the topic, but it's also a reflection of the fact that this is a really, really common issue. So the fact that people are here and awake and alert, I think is really a reflection on how common this is and how a lot of us are dealing with the same types of issues. So to start, and I apologize, I'm going to turn because I have to kind of look behind me a little bit. I want to give you a little bit of a background on me so you know who you're listening to. I want to take you back to the year 2002 when I was working as a child behavior specialist. That's kind of a fancy term for someone that doesn't really know what they're doing, but is working with kids who have behavior problems. My background was that I had a degree in clinical psychology and a focus on child development. So I really thought I knew how to manage kids. But unfortunately, my success rate was just absolutely terrible. I was really bad at doing this kind of work. So my point in starting with this background is not to say that the DSRF made a big mistake and they asked the wrong person to come, but rather to just highlight that this is really hard work. It takes a lot of practice, and it's not instinctual. It is a lot of this is about turning off what your natural instincts would be, which would be to react from the title, right? Respond, but don't react. And to think in a kind of preparatory manner about how these behaviors should be managed and what's going to be most effective. So we're really talking about being proactive rather than reactive. Because this is such hard work, it's really unlikely that anyone in this room, myself included, is going to have 100% success. It just doesn't seem to work that way. So it's like when you go meet with a financial advisor and they always show you the same graph. I know that your IRA is in trouble or your 401k is in trouble, but just hang on. Over time it will get better. And that's kind of how we see behavior play out, is that over time there are a lot of bumps in the road. There are a lot of, times where you're making progress and then times where things seem to fall apart. But over time, things do seem to get better. I tell a lot of families it's like watching the grass grow. You're aware of it every day. You notice all those negative behaviors and they make you want to tear your hair out. But when you look back in time, and so a lot of the families that I work with, I say, let's just look back to a year ago and see what was happening. So now you're telling me, your child's refusing to go to math class, but a year ago your child was running out into the street, right? So I think things are better, even though we're still frustrated. So I ask people to keep in mind that really what our goal here is improvement over time, not perfection. It's not a black or white, you do what I'm going to suggest for 2 weeks and then you never have to deal with behavior again. That's just not reality. It's that this is a long slog, and we want things to just steadily improve over time with some bumps in the road that we should expect. Because it is a long road, and because there's a lot of frustration along the way, we have to be really, really careful about how we treat ourselves, right, as the adults in the equation. I see a lot of families get really burned out. And I think there are a lot of professionals in the room, too. Could I maybe just have a quick raise of hands for parents and families? Okay. And then professionals? All right, so pretty good ratio. So for all of us, if we don't think about ourselves any time during this long, long process, we're not going to be able to last, right? We're not going to be able to do it over the long haul and do things consistently, which is really what's key. So a lot of times when I meet with families, I say, you know what, I'm going to give you a little bit of behavior homework, but the real homework is to go out and do something fun and forget about this for a night, right? If you're lucky enough to be in a 2-parent home, go on a date, go have fun. Go out with your friends, whatever it may be. Taking care of yourself, I can't stress it enough, is really, really important if you want this to work over the long haul. So here we have Popeye and Olive Oyl on their first date, and Olive Oyl is worried that she has spinach in her teeth, but Popeye is really happy that she does. So let's start by giving a little bit of a lay of the lands, the epidemiology, or how common are behavior problems in individuals with Down syndrome. The answer is really common. About 30% of people with Down syndrome have clinically significant, is the term we would use, behavior problems. That means you come see someone like me, and I say, yes, this is pretty substantial. It's impacting your daily life. I have a name for it, and here you go, right? But a lot more people with Down syndrome have behavior problems that might not really need to be diagnosed by someone like me, but still cause a lot of trouble, right? And I see a lot of nodding, which is not surprising. I think most families that I encounter have at least some challenges, which is probably true of any group of families and children as well. But in contrast, only about 10% of typically developing children have a behavior disorder that can be diagnosed by someone like me. So that's, if you have Down syndrome, you're about 3 times more likely to have such a condition. Sorry, I'm just still getting used to not being able to see the slides a little bit, pardon me. One of the issues that I think about a lot is that when you have behavior problems as a child, you're much more likely to have behavior problems as an adult. Okay? So behavior problems in childhood predict behavior problems in adulthood. The problem with that is that when you look at what happens to people long term, which is my passion, is to think about, okay, I see this 4-year-old in front of me, but I want to know what can I do for this child to help him or her be the happiest and healthiest at age 27, right? I'm thinking way, way down the road. And it's not just because I'm a psychologist and I'm a little neurotic. It's because that's really what I think is important. So it turns out that there are all sorts of positive outcomes for people with Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities. But the issue is that all the things that would predict a good outcome, like your language and your social skills and your self-care and how well you get around the community, a lot of that seems to be washed out by behavior problems. So if you have behavior problems, it kind of makes sense. You can be social and have really great language, and you can really know your way around public transportation. But if you're going to get on the bus and whack somebody, or you're going to come home and take someone else's food, people are not really going to want to hang out with you. That's pretty obvious. So my message here is not that we should all be terrified and this is really bad news. It's that when we see behavior issues in people with Down syndrome, we really have to do something about it. We handle everything at our clinic at Boston Children's. We deal with, I couldn't even begin to list all the issues that we face. But when behavior comes up, we take it really, really seriously because of that. Because we know that it can have a big impact on adulthood. So now let's talk about why, right? Why do we see all these issues for people with Down syndrome, in particular in behavior? And I always come back to the brain, right? So that's, I'm a neurodevelopmental guy. That's what I think about a lot of the time. And there are some really key brain differences that seem to be related to some of the issues that we see in behavior. So the first one is that the frontal lobe is really different. So this is where, the executive functions live. We're going to come back to this in a minute. People who have attention disorders like ADHD, a lot of trouble with the frontal lobe. We also see problems with the brainstem and the cerebellum, where a lot of the motor functions live. We also see problems in the temporal lobe and the hippocampus, which is where a lot of learning and memory takes place. So that was a nice picture, but now we should probably talk about what it means in English. So what are the consequences of those differences in the brain? We're going to break these down into categories. I'm going to flip pages with you. So the first category is social. And this is the one that a lot of people are focused on. When people, ask, could you describe, the community of people with Down syndrome? A lot of times what comes up, especially for people that don't actually know many people with Down syndrome, is, oh, so social and sweet, right? That's the kind of stereotype that is sometimes true, sometimes not. But very often we do see that people with Down syndrome are really hyper-aware, right? They're engaged with other people. There are really cool studies where they look at infants with Down syndrome versus infants without Down syndrome. And the infants with Down syndrome actually do much better on tests of social engagement and intersubjectivity, understanding there's another person over there and they're separate from me and my behavior impacts them and their behavior impacts me, which is pretty cool. It's really an incredible strength. But if you think about it, if you're hyper-aware, so if you're incredibly aware of other people at all times, that also may have some downsides, right? You're probably going to be also pretty sensitive. So if other people in your environment, if you are catching every little thing, every little facial expression, every change in tone of voice, you're probably also going to pick up when those tones of voice are not so positive, right? And those facial expressions are maybe not the nicest facial expressions. Does that make sense? Okay. So I like to think about this as what I call the social and emotional radar. It's this really, really powerful radar for people with Down syndrome. What we also see in studies of people with Down syndrome when we're looking at socialization is that there tends to be a more what we call aggressive social problem solving. This is also known as hitting. And that one always gets a laugh. So the psychologists tend to do that. We take something pretty simple and we slap a really complicated term on it. We also see differences in language. So we see that receptive language is typically stronger than expressive language, right? My speech folks in the back, my friends that I met earlier, am I right? Okay. So it's not always true, but generally speaking, it's true. And there tend to be a lot of difficulties with articulation, so getting those words out clearly so that other people can understand them, and then also formulating your ideas. So, what I find often, and I know so many kids and adolescents with Down syndrome at this point, from my clinical work and from my past life volunteering, is that most of the people that I work with and that I encounter have so many ideas. They have so many thoughts about the world. They have so many observations, some of them pretty profound. And how frustrating must it be to not be able to get them out, right? To have it all in my head, but not be able to share it with you. You know what I mean? I think it makes people really, really frustrated. And we see that for sure, especially in young kids when they don't have much language at all. And they really want to play with that other little boy in preschool, but they can't get it out. So eventually they're going to just go over and whack that kiddo, right? Aggressive social problem solving. We also see some other differences in terms of information processing. So we know for some reason, and it's, again, the reason is the way the brain is structured, that visual information coming in works much, much better than verbal information coming in, typically, on average. Very few exceptions in my experience to that. Have people noticed that? People, I'm sure, have heard about that. Okay. There are also differences with what's called encoding and consolidation. So that means the information comes in through the front, it goes toward the midbrain, and is it going to pass through and stick, or is it kind of going to get stuck or not get through at all, right? So you might notice that people with Down syndrome do a lot better when information is repeated over and over, and there's lots of review, right? Let's do this many, many times until we kind of build, what we might call muscle memory, that you just kind of know it implicitly. But presenting something once, especially verbally, probably not going to work so well. So I take this a step further when I'm thinking about behavior. If information coming in from the world, especially from all of us adults in the room that tell you a little secret, we all talk way, way too much, right? And we hold people, especially children, accountable for what we're saying. Why didn't you listen to my direction, right? That kind of thing. Has anyone ever said that? I have never. But if you are constantly being bombarded with language and demands from your environment, and you may not really be processing all of that information, I think the world gets pretty scary, right? Very, very quickly. We see this in medical settings, or in medical procedures, rather. This is a new topic that we're studying now, that kids freak out, right? and sometimes over very minor things. I have a wonderful 15-year-old boy that I've been working with for years who's incredible. He has a job. You know, he is on the wrestling and the football team. He's just a superstar. But he will not get his blood drawn, and it doesn't matter. You know, how many times we can explain it to him does not matter. And I think that difficulty with processing new information does make the world pretty scary. And when people are scared, they act out, right? When they think someone's going to hurt me, we all act out. We have to defend ourselves, right? That fight or flight instinct kicks in. Does that make sense? Okay. It's nice when you ask a crowd of 200 people, does that make sense? And then even if one person nods, you can kind of keep going. We also see motivation differences. So there have been studies that talk about what's called task mastery in Down syndrome. And what the studies have found is that people with Down syndrome, they think there are differences in the emotional regulation system of the brain, and that people have a bit less what's called intrinsic motivation, kind of a get up and go, I want to finish this task. Doesn't matter if you're going to give me a reward or if you're going to pat me on the back. I just want to do it because I want to do it. So I think those studies, you know, have some validity and they were done well. But I also have another way of viewing this, which I like to call the gas in the tank theory, because I love cars. So what I mean by that is that if you have a disability, everything you're doing throughout the day takes a little more energy, right? So if you consider a car with a full tank of gas in the morning, and you have, you know, William who has Down syndrome, and you have Jonathan who does not, all through the day, they're in their classroom, William's energy is being depleted a little bit faster, right? Because it's harder to process the language, it's harder to hold on to the information, it's harder to deal with some of the behavioral demands, et cetera, et cetera. So when you compare William and Jonathan, you might notice that William is getting frustrated more quickly, right? So I don't know, is that, you know, just an inherent difference in the brain, or is it really kind of what we would call cognitive fatigue? You know, and I think it's probably a little bit of both. And the last one we're going to talk about is executive function. Executive functions are all those different processes in the brain that allow you to get stuff done, right? So you have a goal. I want to get myself to Vancouver and present this talk without saying too many times, right? I need to do all these different things. I need to plan it. I need to organize. I need to, you know, be aware of how I'm doing as I go, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in individuals with Down syndrome, we do see some challenges with executive function, which does live in that primarily in the front of the brain, right? So we know that there are some differences there, and we see it behaviorally that a lot of kids, especially at earlier ages, will struggle to kind of stop themselves and think about, what are the consequences of this? Maybe I shouldn't do this, right? If my mom just said, I have to finish my dinner before I can play with the iPad, maybe I should just finish my dinner instead of, you know, throwing it on the floor, whacking my sister, and stealing the iPad from her, right? I always get to use real examples because I have plenty of them. So executive function issues can cause a lot of behavioral challenges. So if we think about the world we live in, I think about it as a perfect storm, right? As adults, we talk way, way too much, as I said before. We ask kids to sit in a classroom all day long and follow directions. We do not provide a lot of visual supports baseline. I think now we're getting much, much better at that as a society, which is great. But the kind of basic baseline way that we like to go through the world as adults is not really all that well suited to people with Down syndrome, especially children, but it does extend into adolescence and adulthood. So I see that again as a perfect storm for people to act out, right? The best models of behavior challenges, I think, are that people act out when they're out of other options, you know? I think of it as you go to a foreign country, you don't know the language, no one will listen to you, you're in pain, you're hungry, whatever. Eventually, at some point, you're going to break down and just start doing aggressive things to get what you need so you can survive, right? We all have that point where we will just do whatever it takes. And that is how you can think about behavior, that when people are out of other good options, they're going to act out, you know? And I think that's really helpful because when we experience behavior problems as an adult, our instinct is to think, the purpose of this behavior is to make me crazy, right? Is that a fair statement? I know we don't believe it in our minds, but in our hearts, you know, if we want to use that type of terminology, it feels that way. You know, in the moment, it feels like this kid is just trying to, you know, I've never experienced it because I'm a psychologist, but I've heard. So on a serious note, though, we have to remember that when behaviors are occurring, we need to be thoughtful about why it's occurring and how we're going to respond. Because if we use our gut instinct that, man, this kid's just trying to drive me crazy, we're probably going to respond in really counterproductive ways. And that's kind of the gut instinct of most adults. That's how we're wired. It's not something any of us need to feel bad about. It's just, again, our instinct. So now that we know why behavior problems show up, I assume most of you would like to have some ideas about what we could do about them, right? So we're going to talk about lots of different things. We're going to talk about the relationship. We're going to talk about behavior principles. We're going to talk about functions of a behavior, which is a really important concept. We're going to talk about positive behavior strategies. We're going to talk about how to change the environment to really use the strengths of people with Down syndrome to help them do their best behaviorally. And then finally, we're going to talk about discipline. So to start with the relationship, this is my favorite study of all time. Harry Harlow, 1959. Has anyone ever seen this? Anyone who took a psychology class, you probably saw this. So before the 50s, basically the leading theory of development and, you know, why parents and children like each other in any way was survival, right? Drive, instinct, that parents fed their kids and gave them shelter and kept them warm, so therefore their kids loved them, you know, and that's why they were attached to them. And people were starting to question this. So Harlow did this really cool study where he took rhesus monkeys and he put them in cages, and each rhesus monkey had two mothers. One mother on the left was the wire mother. Sorry to neglect you guys. The wire mother, who was the same internal structure but just wire, but had this kind of mechanical looking head and provided food pellets and water. So it met all the basic needs. And there were no issues with temperature in the cages. The other mother was wrapped, the same structure, but wrapped in a terry cloth, so kind of felt nice, and had a head that looked a lot more like a monkey's. So if drive theory were true, that kids only really liked their parents because they fed them and, you know, gave them water, etc., then you would expect that the monkey would spend most of their time with the wire mother, right? That would make sense. But the exact opposite was true. So to sleep, to hang out and relax, when they got scared, when they were happy, the monkeys all clung to the terry cloth mother. They'd go over and get a bite and get a drink from the other mother and then ignore it completely. So that was the first of a series of studies. This has been replicated with tons of different animals and now with humans as well, showing that having a good relationship and a bond with a parent, so a parent-child bond, and I extend this to professionals too, to teachers. You know, there's a lot of good research about how important just having one person in your life that cares about you as a kid can be to development. But what we've found over many, many decades now is that having that relationship does all sorts of good things for your development, for your brain development, for your ability to tolerate stress, for how much your body freaks out when it senses danger, the HPA axis reactivity, all sorts of different stuff. So really, the more it's studied, the more conclusive it seems that the relationship between a parent and a child, or again, I extend it to teachers, therapists, etc., is really, really important. So I basically think that when you don't know what to do, just think about what's best for your relationship with your child, and that's the right answer for that moment. So it might mean taking a walk. It might mean tag your it to another family member. I got to get away. You know, whatever it is at that moment. The relationship is primary. Okay, So now we're going to talk about behavioral principles. The basics of behavior are incredibly easy. I can explain it to you in 5 seconds flat. But they're pretty hard to do, you know. Behavior is simple, I think. But being consistent about it and really using the principles and considering them when you're maybe a bit frustrated, which may occasionally happen to some people in the room. Again, never to me thus far. It can be much, much harder to do. So basically, you want to reinforce what you want to see more of. So the good behaviors, you reinforce. You provide something nice that makes that behavior more likely to recur. And you don't reinforce what you want to go away. Done. We can all go, take a walk. So here we have Pavlov, and his dog is kind of turning the tables on him, saying, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll write in his little book, So how do we reinforce good behavior? Well, the simple one is attention, right? If you notice a behavior, it changes. This is a really well-studied effect. The first big study was termed the Hawthorne effect, and basically what happened was there was this factory that was not performing so well, and so they brought in all these consultants to figure out what the problem was. They brought in the consultants, and the productivity shot up, and everyone was like, what is going on? And they soon figured out that it was just because someone was watching and paying attention that the behavior changed. So this has been proven true over and over and over again. Weight Watchers uses that very strategy, right? You write down what you eat, you pay a lot of attention to it. There's also support, which is helpful. But just paying attention makes a behavior change. So if you want to change, how much you exercise or, how much chocolate you eat or something like that, write it down. It will change. You'll enhance your awareness. Paying attention to behavior, if you think about people who are really social, right? If someone is wired neurologically to be really, really engaged with other people, paying attention to them and to their behavior is going to be extra powerful, right? It's powerful for pretty much all of us, but this is going to be even more enhanced for this group of people. If we want to take that a little further, we would say we want to praise the good behavior, right? We point it out, and I know you guys have all heard this before, but you see a nice behavior. I love how you're tying your shoes, right? Great, easy to do, but noticing that behavior is really critical and really important. So here we have a husband and wife, and the wife is feeling that she is not getting much attention, so she sticks her head in the computer and says, "Now will you pay attention to me?" Attention is really important for all of us. So if we want to take this another step, we would move into what's called token economies. So I'm going to pause here on this for a moment. When people are having behavior problems, it is much, much more common to notice all of those negative behaviors than it is to notice any of the good behaviors. So this has been studied over and over and over again. When kids are acting out, their parents get frustrated, and all of a sudden you have your own radar for bad behavior, and you notice every single one of them. And then a good behavior happens, and it's like, yeah, whatever. I'm frustrated. You're upsetting me. That's nice that you did one positive thing after a day of craziness. That is a real problem, though, because that teaches kids that, I can't turn it around. Why bother, right? I'm just stuck in this pattern. And we call it negative behavioral momentum, right? It's like you get kind of swirling down a path, like think Tasmanian devil, and you're doing all these negative behaviors, getting all sorts of negative reactions. And for the child and for the parent, it feels irreversible, right? It's just, this is just tough. What are we going to do about this, I might as well not even try. So what token economies do, I think, is they remind the adults. I have a different view on token economies than you might often hear, which is that I think it's more for the adults. So that when things are going bad, every day, no matter what's happening, your child or your student has the opportunity to get some good feedback from you. And that teaches what's called differential reinforcement, right? So that teaches you do something good, you're going to get attention and it's going to be fun. You do something negative, you're not going to get that attention, it's not going to be so fun. But if your child is getting a lot of negative attention when they do bad behaviors and getting nothing when they do good behaviors, they're not going to do many of those good behaviors, right? Does that make sense? So this is like such a simple concept, but I think this is really the linchpin. A lot of people hear the words token economy and want to like plug their ears and run out of the room. I don't think it has to be a hard thing. I think it should be easy, and that's the way to make it effective. An example I use for how simple I want this to be, or an analogy, is anyone a marathoner in this room? I'm actually more interested in the non-marathoners. Great. Okay. So if I say to most people in this room, myself included, go home tonight and run 15 miles and I'll give you $100, right? People would say, you're crazy, right? But if I said, go home tonight, walk around the block and I'll give you $10, people might say, yeah, that's not so bad. That's a pretty good deal, right? We have to start slow. We have to do things that will fit with your lives and will not be so hard to do that you run out, the door screaming. And it's a trap that a lot of people fall into, that they get excited about something that might help with behavior, and they get really into it, and they want to go way, way overboard. And it might last for a few days, but it's unrealistic that it's going to last forever. I'll give you two examples. One example, I came up with a token economy, or I explained token economies and a reward chart to a mom, and we agreed to meet again in a month to see how it was going. And she came into my office with a chart that was probably from here to here, with about 100 activities on it that the kid could do throughout the day. And great idea, great motivation, but way, way too much. Another family said to me that every time their child finished all their chores, they were going to go to the amusement park. Well, I want the child to do these chores every day. I don't know how much you like amusement parks, but that's a lot. So I like to keep it really, really simple. We set a few goals, right? What are a few things that this child could do around the house? They don't have to be anything miraculous. They could be stuff that the child's doing already. That's totally fine. We build a structure around it. We keep it really, really simple, so the child needs to be able to understand it, right? So whether it's through sign or an iPad or verbally, I want that child to explain to me how their behavior plan works, right? What do you need to do to get a reward? How do you get a prize? If they can point and say, I just worked with a kid the other day, put my shoes away, hang my jacket up, feed the dog. And he was showing me, he has hardly any language, but he understood, and then he gets his prize, right? Wonderful. Does not need to be difficult. Token economies are really effective because they're built on many of the strategies that we know work for people with Down syndrome, because we know how the brain works, right? So they're visual, primarily. They involve a lot of repetition, right? It's the same every day. It's routine. It provides sameness. And remember what we talked about? That reduces anxiety, right? We know what's coming next. We're not having to think, I don't know what this morning is going to be like. It's going to be different than every other morning, right? It's one of 100 varieties, We are building in motivators, and we're building in attention for positive behaviors, right? So it's kind of this really simple thing that just gets at all the different areas of need for people with Down syndrome. So I like Apple products, and I think Apple has it right in a lot of ways because they keep things simple, right? That's the whole beauty of Apple. Apologies to anyone in the room who has strong feelings against Apple, but I think they do that pretty well. So my token economies are nothing special. They are not beautiful. They are not complex. They are easy. This is with Microsoft Word, clip art. It took about 5 minutes to make. I make them with tons and tons of kids. We picked a few jobs. So for this kiddo, it was put your pants on, put your shirt on, and brush your teeth in the morning. That's it. And then you get a little reward. And we're going to talk about what the reward is in a moment. But this is not complicated, right? Let's now, though, take a step back and think about what this would look like without that chart, right? I'm sure no one in this room has ever had this experience, but I have heard that some families in the morning say to their kid, get your shirt on, get your pants on, we're going to miss the bus, we're going to be late for school, come on. Think about what's happening in that interaction. Tons of language, it's all language, right? There's no visual. There's tons of emotion, right? It's like the exact wrong fit for people with Down syndrome, right? So I know what I'm proposing is not complicated, and that's a good thing, I think, because I think that means people could actually do it and have it not be a huge imposition to the family. But it's also that it takes a lot of stress off of the relationship, right? Because instead of mom or dad or teacher running after the kiddo and saying, do this, now do this, and the kid says, no, and doesn't like all the language, doesn't like all the emotion, now you say, instead of it, I'm going to pick on you, okay? Now instead of it being, you're telling me what to do and I'm saying no, right? Now it's, hey, look, what does the chart say? There's a third party, right? Instead of a dyad, we're now a triad. And you can say, it's not me. And when I make these with families, I always say, blame me, and I tell the kid, this is your homework from me. Blame that Stein guy from the hospital, it's his fault. Because my most important priority is the parent and child relationship, right? So when you can add something visual and separate and structured and routinized, it takes a lot of the pressure off of that interaction. And I can't tell you how many families have, said, it's going to be hard or it's going to be too complicated, and usually I'll make a schedule with them because I don't want that to be the barrier. But when they get over that hump and just throw it up on the refrigerator or on the bedroom wall, they come back, and I can't count how many families at this point they come back and they say, morning routine's pretty awesome now, we haven't had any issues, right? It's not magic. It's not going to be perfect forever. You're going to have to change these things, but it does have a lot of benefits, and it's pretty simple to do. Is that fair to say that this is not a big, daunting task? Okay. So now we're going to talk about the functions of behavior. Every behavior has a purpose, right? Like I said before, our instinct is that the purpose of every behavior is to make us crazy and to make us upset, or to make a sibling upset or a classmate upset. But really, when you break it down, every behavior has a reason. It has a function. There is something that the child is trying to get, either something that they need or something that they don't want to be a part of, right? If we want to manage a behavior once it's occurred, because so far we've been talking about how to promote positive behaviors, how to keep things smooth and steady. If we want to deal with a negative behavior, we have to understand why it's happening, right? So we usually talk about the ABCs of behavior, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. What comes before, the trigger, if you will, the actual behavior, and then what happens afterward. Pretty simple stuff, right? In Down syndrome, there are a couple of really, really common ones. There are lots of these functions of behaviors, but these are the ones that will get you 90% of the way, typically. Number one is escape and avoidance, right? Math is hard for me, I'm out of here. Has anyone ever experienced that? It's always math. Not always, but very often. Or conversely, I like this. I don't want to leave, right? I'm escaping or I'm avoiding ending the activity that I like. So you say it's time to leave the birthday party, I am on the floor, dead weight, good luck to you, right? Anyone ever seen that one? We have a lot of stop and flop, okay. The next one would be attention seeking, right? So I learned this one really, really quickly when I was training at Children's in Boston, when I would be in an office and we have one-way mirrors, so my boss is behind the mirror and she says, you have to get through all, she's very nice, but at that time oh my goodness, I have to get through this whole list of questions, I have to figure this all out, I only have an hour. et cetera, et cetera. So I'm trying to fire through these questions. I gave the kid a couple toys. Yeah, kiddo, play with these toys. Let me not get in trouble with my boss. And after 10 minutes, the toys that we have at the hospital are always broken and falling apart because there's just so many kids playing with them. He got bored with the toys, lights out, right? Runs over, turns the lights out. So the first instinct, even for me, was, this kid's trying to get me in trouble with my boss. He's trying to frustrate me. He's trying to drive me crazy. The parents are horrified. Oh my goodness, he can't even keep it together at the doctor's office. This is terrible, right? But if you take a step back and you think about it, what's the function of that behavior? The function of the behavior is, you know what? This is really boring. Like, these are the toys? Seriously, guy? This is what you're going to give me? And he has a point, So as I've kind of gotten, more experience with this, when that type of thing happens, first of all, I try to avoid it by having more toys, more options, being more aware of the kiddo. But secondly, when things do happen, I think, you know what? And I talk to parents in that moment when my office gets trashed, which happens all the time. Sherry, my coworker, can vouch for that. When that happens, I say to parents, you know what? Because immediately the parents want to jump in and say, oh, Jonathan, why did you do that? Like very embarrassing, I think, right, for the family. And I say, no, this is on me. This is my fault, right? I am not doing what I need to do. I am not, giving him what he needs in this moment. Yes, we have skills to build. There could be, maybe we could work on asking for something else to do before we just go to the negative behavior. But for this little boy who has very little language, he didn't have a lot of options, right? So he did the only thing at his disposal. And I wasn't giving him the chance, right, to communicate with me because I was so focused on getting what I needed and impressing my boss, So escape and avoidance is a big one. Attention seeking, I think, is the one that we see the most. I mentioned before already, little kids we see a lot when they don't have a lot of language, but they're really interested in their peers in preschool or what have you. Their instinct is to go over and whack the other kid, right? And it's understandable. It's not that they want to hurt that other child, but if you want to play and everyone else is playing and no one's playing with you, and you're trying, hey, look what, you're trying everything at your disposal, it doesn't work, eventually you're going to get to a point where you just whack, right? It kind of does make some sense. But again, if we think about it just kind of with a knee-jerk, instinctual reaction, we're not going to view it that way. We're going to view it as, this is willful. This child's trying to upset me or hurt a peer, right? So we have to really take a step back and think about, why is this happening? And it's not so hard to do, but it is kind of an emotional process in that you have to turn down your own emotions for a moment to allow yourself to think, why could this be happening, right? Which is hard to do in the moment. So why are these behaviors so common? If we think about the brain, again, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you have some issues with intrinsic motivation and you're running out of gas, it makes a lot of sense to say, get me out of here. I don't like this. I've been doing this too long, right? I'm tired. I'm frustrated. If you have a lot of language or you have a lot of, social skills as an adult, for example, we all have various ways of, looking down at our phone or, saying I need to go get a cup of coffee, right? To get out of something that we can't handle it anymore. But for kids, we don't have those options. And if we're really social and we don't have a lot of impulse control, it also makes sense to just do about anything to get some attention, right? You want that attention, you love other people, you're missing attention, and you're not really considering the consequences of your actions, right? So you're going to just go do whatever it takes to get that attention. Does that make sense? I think a lot of this stuff is, I try and be really simple because I think it is simple stuff. It's very easy to understand. It's carrying it out that's harder. But if you have my goal for everyone in the room today is just have a really, really solid grasp on the concepts, which I hope can be simple and kind of clear in your mind. And then when you're faced with complicated situations, you can kind of think about them through that lens. Okay, so now we're going to talk about positive behavior support strategies. just a moment on that term. Positive behavior support is this, again, kind of a psychologist-type term for a pretty simple idea, right? What are the things that you can do to prevent behaviors, to bring about good behaviors? What's really interesting is that these have been shown to be much more effective than what we all learned, when we were kids about, you see a negative behavior and you punish it, right? So it's not just that, we're all becoming soft and, cuddly as a society, but it actually has been shown that it works better to do these positive strategies. So when escape and avoidance is driving a behavior, there are lots of things that we can do to boost motivation, even for things that kids don't want to do. There are tons of strategies, and we can't go through all of them. We'd be here all day. But we can talk about some of the most powerful ones that work particularly well for people with Down syndrome. And I can talk about when we're done, and we can do, I think there's a Q&A after. I'm happy to talk about other resources where you can get more comprehensive lists, et cetera. So the first one is choices, right? So again, let's back up for a moment and think about what it's like to be a child with a disability or an adolescent or an adult with a disability. What tends to happen is that you are being directed all day long, right? People in your environment, usually the ones that are taller than you, the adults, are telling you, do this, and now do this. Oh, you did that wrong, do it again. And now do this, right? It gets really old. I would not like that if that's how I were treated at work or what have you. And I don't think anyone enjoys that. We kind of lose sight of that with kids in general, but especially for children with disabilities. So a lot of times we say to kids, brush your teeth. And they say, no, right? And for kids with Down syndrome, they might add, no, and I'm also going to sit on the floor, and you're not going to move me, right? But a really interesting thing happens when you actually, instead of just telling a kiddo what to do, you actually say, you know what? You're part of this process. You can have some power here. You have some control over your own life. What do you think? Should we do the potty first or brush your teeth first? And it's amazing. All of a sudden, the kid's like, oh, yeah, I think I'll brush my teeth first, or I'll do the potty first, right? Because typically it's not that the child does not want to do that activity and is just inherently opposed to that activity. Sometimes that might be the case. That's a different story. But often it's just, you've been telling me what to do all day, guy. I want to have a say in this, right? So giving a choice oftentimes breaks up what we call a power struggle, right? Where it's the adult versus the child or the adolescent, and we're just butting heads, right? So when I think about that, I view it as a tug of war, and I always tell parents, drop the rope, right? Let the child have some control, and you're going to get where you need to go much faster with a lot less angst, generally speaking. Redirection is another really powerful one. So oftentimes when people are frustrated, you see a negative behavior starting to play out, and your instinct is to say, don't do that, right? No, you're in trouble before you even did it because I saw you were going to do it, that kind of thing, right? Redirection is basically saying you see the behavior coming, you see it developing, and you intervene sooner, right? You don't let it happen. The way that I like to do this is, and this is based on the fact that people with Down syndrome, again, on average, tend to be very socially engaged and to therefore like to please others, that I find it's really effective when you say, hey, can you help me? Can you do this for me? Can you do this with me? Can you help me clean up the table? Can you help me clean up the thousands of blocks on the floor of my office, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, definitely, I can do that, right? And then the nice thing is that when that behavior is completed, not only did you avoid a negative behavior, but the child then senses a genuine appreciation in you, right? All of a sudden, you're happy. So in terms of the parent-child relationship or interaction or teacher-child interaction, instead of it being, you did something bad and I'm really mad at you, right? And you're getting all that negative social feedback, all of a sudden now you're getting, wow, thanks, you did something awesome. And what we're building is positive behavioral momentum, right? I'm a lefty, so left is positive, right is negative. No offense to any righties. So does that make sense, though? So redirection is a really simple thing, but it has really profound consequences. It's something that we can use all the time, and it's really, really effective in preventing behaviors when they're already starting to kind of bubble up. I also like to talk about providing the carrot, right? And so that's first, then directions. So that would be pairing or sequencing something that we call a non-preferred task with a preferred task, right? So first you do this, then you do that. First do your math homework, then play a game, right? First eat your dinner, then watch a movie with your sister, right? Anything. It can be anything. And these are things that can be done spur of the moment, right? Kids are refusing. And we know that this is a group of people for whom there can be a higher risk of like just kind of, for all the brain-based reasons we talked about, tending to just say, no, I'm not going to do that, right? Without a really clear reason, without any, big master plan behind it. And we can kind of undo that by saying, you know what, we're kind of inherently saying, I know you don't want to do this. This is something you don't like. But if you do it, then you can get something else, right? And it's the same for us, right? So when I have to sit in my office for hours on end writing reports, which is, not the most fun thing to do, it's helpful if I can say, well, you know what, I'm going to write all these reports and then I can go for a run or something like that, right? We all do those things kind of inherently, and we can do that for kids too. So these are really easy strategies that are really, really effective. When attention seeking is driving a behavior, we have a really easy option for intervention. So we're going to take an example. Joshua loves to go into his sister's room. He loves to jump on her bed. And when he does it, his sister and his dad run into the room and get really, really upset. Josh laughs at them and keeps going more vigorously until his dad tosses him over his shoulder and takes him out of the room, right? Has anyone ever encountered anything like that before? Okay, all the examples are from clinic. So what's the function of this behavior? Attention, right? He's getting a lot of attention for this. What is reinforcing the behavior?
The yelling and the throwing over his shoulder.
Yeah, the yelling, the getting upset, lots of emotion, right? And remember, even though the content of what Joshua's dad and sister is saying is negative, we don't like your behavior, stop doing it, you're upsetting us. The content of the words are not being processed nearly as well as emotion, attention, right? Eye contact. So it kind of doesn't really matter what you're saying. And I think that's a really important lesson. If you forget everything else that I've said today, remember that the content of what you're saying is not really a good tool for behavior management for people with Down syndrome in particular. It's your body language, your tone of voice, your facial expressions, and the emotion attached to it. That's what's really getting in there. So again, when kids are in my office and completely trashing it, I don't yell, I don't raise my voice, I don't even say anything. I don't give a strong facial expression. Parents sometimes think I might be a little bit nuts when I do this, but my office is getting trashed over here, and I look at my notes and I turn and I remove eye contact and I pretend nothing's happening. And often what happens is within a few seconds, the child's like, hey man, I'm trashing your office, where's my attention, right? So they will often come to me looking for, hey, how can I engage you? And I'll say, oh, can you help me clean up the mess that we just made, right? It really, really works. With our postdoctoral fellows, they all start with these really elaborate behavior plans to get kids through these 4-hour testing sessions that we have to do. By the end of their training, I usually expect them to be able to do that without any system, just by using their tone of voice and their facial expressions and their body language, right? They can totally shape the kiddo's behavior. You start acting up, you start testing me, nothing. You're doing what I want, awesome, you're doing the best job ever, this is great. It really, really works. Okay, so what could be done differently for Josh? Yeah, so what would happen if we just didn't react at all? So that is what the family tried, right? And it was a little tricky because there was another child involved. So I had to talk with Josh's sister about, this is why it's happening. And when you get really upset, it makes it really, really fun for him. I know this is really basic stuff, but it's really important. Sure enough, they stopped paying attention to this. They stopped freaking out when Josh did it. And all of a sudden, the behavior's gone really, really quickly, right? The jumping on the bed, yes, it's fun in itself. But really what he was after was the attention. And it went away. So often when I bring up ignoring, people, have a lot of concerns, right? You can't ignore everything, and I'm the first to admit that. Do you mind if I'm definitely going to save time for questions, I think. So Ross Greene wrote a book called The Explosive Child. It's not my favorite title for a book. I don't think it fits exactly with people with Down syndrome, but he does have some really helpful concepts in there, and he talks about the baskets of ignoring. So basically what it is so many of the behaviors you're facing are attention-seeking, right? Is that fair to say, especially parents in the room? I'm curious, a lot of the negative stuff that you see, is it fair to say that when you really take a step back and think about it, that a lot of it is looking for attention? That's typically what I hear? Okay. So what Dr. Greene has done is broken down ignoring into a few different baskets that help you kind of organize your thoughts. So basket one is that it's a safety issue, right? Child is running into the street. Do not ignore. Go get that kiddo. Do not let her get hit by a car, right? That's a pretty obvious one. Basket number two is stuff that's frustrating and, it might be problematic. It might not be. So for example, I had a family where their son was eating dinner, on the couch in the living room instead of sitting with the family at the dinner table, right? So I talked with them, is this one of your top 3 or 5 concerns? And remember this family, last year we were talking about grabbing knives and chasing the sister around the house, right? They said, okay, maybe he can eat, dinner on the couch. Excuse me. So that basket two would be kind of hit or miss. It depends if it's a priority right now. Basket three are behaviors that are annoying, but if you take a step back and really think about them, they're not really hurting anybody. So for example, humming, some tongue clicking, stuff like that. Even, you could say swearing, right? For older kids, especially, sometimes we'll develop a habit of swearing, seeing that gets lots and lots of attention, right? Parents will punish, parents will freak out, parents will get upset, teachers will get upset. Sure enough, when you kind of say, you know what, this is not that big of a deal, I'm going to just ignore it, and a lot of times it goes away, right, because the attention is removed. So this is a good way of thinking about what you should respond to and what you do not need to respond to. And a lot of parents that I've worked with will come in with tons and tons of behavior concerns, but after we work together for a little while, they'll come in and say, you know what, yeah, something came up, but it's really a basket three, we're just going to let it go. And again, a lot of times it's a really nice thing because the behaviors will go away. So I think this stuff seems really, really simple. That's my goal, is for it to be simple so that you might actually be able to do some of it and to hang on to it for the long term. But the hard thing is when you get upset, right? So I think this is what I looked like in 2002, is that kids would act out and I would just, take it as an affront to me, right? I'm taller than you, kid. How can you be acting out when I said not to do that, right? You should inherently listen to me because I'm taller. So it's really hard to remember these principles when we are upset. But if you can train yourself to think about these things and consider the functions of a behavior and how your reactions are either making the behavior worse or at least keeping it going, you're way, way ahead of the game. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the environment a little bit. If we go back to the strengths and weaknesses, we know that there are some strengths in visual processing. We know that social engagement is typically heightened. And we know that routine and predictability, right, that repetition and review, sameness tends to be helpful. Conversely, we know that language can be an area of weakness and processing new verbal information can be really hard. impulse control, those executive functions, can be difficult, and that inconsistency or a lack of routine doesn't tend to go so well, right? So on a day-to-day basis, we can take our understanding of the brain and Down syndrome, and we can change our environment a little bit to be more friendly, right? Which I think is really, really cool. So it's not that we're managing a negative behavior. It's not that we're even doing a token economy to promote some positive behaviors and get that good momentum going. It's just, you know what? We're making the world a friendlier place. We're going to reduce your frustration. You're probably going to behave more positively as a result. So the first thing would be routine, right? Routine is incredibly important for most children, maybe all children. It's especially important for this group of people. Think about yourselves, right? In the morning, we all kind of get ready, typically in the same exact order every day. That isn't, a commandment. There is no need to do it in that way, but it makes life easier to have a routine, right? We can lose sight of that when we're in a busy household and it's, right before school and everyone's running around and we need to get out the door. And you just, do it however you can do it. Sometimes that's going to happen, right? We're not going to get perfection. But if we can establish this is how it goes, this is the order, it's going to go a lot better. I take that a step further. Again, if we're focused on the future and adulthood, if we can build in some routines like a morning routine, an evening routine, etc. Let's say we have an 8-year-old that is learning, this is how I get ready in the morning. I have my visual schedule. I can do it. I need some prompts here and there. I need some help here and there. But if we can start that at 8 or even sooner, by the time that child is 28, morning routine is like nothing. I don't even think about it, right? I have a morning routine. This is what I do, and this is how I do it. You might even have trouble breaking that routine, right? But that's going to go a long way toward independence as an adult. So again, I view these things as like they're just all sorts of different benefits that kind of all work together. So we need a routine and we need sameness. And if we make that visual, it really comes alive, typically. So again, I don't do anything fancy, right? It's like, this is my morning routine. There's a few pictures. Depending on your artistic abilities, mine are very, very limited. I grab clip art. I usually sit down with the child and say, here's the morning routine. We have these 5 things. Okay, you get dressed. We search on clip art or on Google for pictures of getting dressed, of a shirt or pants or something like that. And the child picks the picture. And then we do that for each job. And then we have our schedule. It's not magic. It takes only a few minutes. It's not expensive. Some families are much more creative, which is great, and might take pictures of the actual child doing the activity, right? Which is also great. But it does not need to be difficult. It does not need to be expensive. It does not need to be time-consuming. And if you get too far ahead of yourself and you say, we're going to do it like to perfection, it's going to be the best picture schedule ever, my fear is that you just, it's like when you say, instead of taking a walk every day for 20 minutes, I'm going to train for, an ultra marathon and run 100 miles next summer. It's like, well, which goal is more realistic over time, right? So similarly, keep it simple, keep it easy, does not need to be too complicated. People tend to also struggle with time, right? Time is a really abstract concept. There are great tools out there. On the left, there's the time timer, which helps kids understand time. So you need to work on your homework for 20 minutes. Instead of just saying 20 minutes, and the kid says, what's 20 minutes? I have no idea what 20 minutes is, right? We have trouble with that too as adults. Well, this counts it down in red, so the red kind of goes away as the time progresses. There's also this other miraculous invention called a microwave timer that works really well also. We can also use social motivators on a daily basis, right? This can be something ongoing, in the moment. So I need you to do something. I'm going to just give you lots of attention. Hey, can you help me with X, right? You can do it. All right, great job. High five. Tends to go really far. We can also use first then with a social motivator. So a kid is, in public, not doing what you want them to do. Hey, first let's get through the grocery store and then we can go get a muffin or something like that, right? Or whatever it may be. But these are all things that you can think about kind of continuously that are not complicated, they're not difficult, they're not expensive, but can help you kind of avoid a lot of negative behaviors and deal with them once they occur. Sometimes things get a lot more difficult, right? So there are situations that can be particularly problematic, especially for people with Down syndrome. So we can take the same ideas of visuals and repetition and structure, and we can create what's called a social story, right? Have people heard of social stories? I imagine many of you have, right? Social stories are not difficult. They are basically taking some pictures or grabbing some pictures online, very few words. Keep it simple. We're showing the sequence of events and what you want to happen, right? The desired behaviors. So big mistake that a lot of people make when they're doing either a job chart, a token economy, or a social story is like one of the goals or one of the pages will be, and no hitting. It's, no. We're showing what we want to happen, right? We don't want to call attention to what we don't want to happen. Hitting happens, we don't want to give that attention. And we're going to do this over many, many repetitions, right? So a lot of times I'll have families create social stories and then use them as a bedtime story. So I had one child that was always bolting in public, and his parents came in and told me that they wanted to go to the Grand Canyon. And I thought, that's the end of my career. But we did social stories, and they read this story with him for about a month about holding hands when he left the camper, and this is how you do this, and this is how you do that. And he did great, right? He had a structure in his mind. Instead of them talking about it with him, probably in what would have been an anxious way, you have to hold our hands, right? Now he just had an internal schema of how this was supposed to go. And when he got to the Grand Canyon, he did beautifully. So we have done this at Boston Children's for sleep studies, which is something that a lot of kids have trouble tolerating. So we made a whole social story with all the different details, pictures, exactly the exact sequence of events and the desired behaviors, and it works really well for a lot of kids. Okay. I have to rush a little bit. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses, we also know what to avoid, right? So the first one would be talking too much. As I've said many, many times, we talk too much as adults, right? So a sibling hits another sibling. If you do that again, you're going to go to your room, you're going to have a timeout, and you'll be in big trouble. I'm going to tell your father, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Or it could be no hit, right? We need to kind of boil down our language to the most important points because our message is going to get lost. We know that routine, again, I've mentioned it probably too many times, is of the utmost importance. And we know that we don't want to give social responses for behaviors that we don't want to see more of, right? So if we do see hitting or we do see running, we don't want to get really worked up and give a lot of eye contact and a lot of emotion and a lot of response, because for the child on a neurological level, that's saying, woo, this is fun, right? Even though mom or dad or teacher or therapist is upset. Okay, so now we're going to just talk about discipline. You notice that I left discipline for last, and I did not leave much time for it. Here we have a child sent to his room. He's playing video games. He's got his basketball hoop. He's on the phone. He said, if they want to punish me, they just send me to their room because it's a lot more boring in there. So why aren't we talking more about discipline? As I mentioned before, positive behavior supports work much better. It's even in the special education law in the US that you have to try positive behavior supports before you go to discipline, which is a very cool addition to the law. And it's based on a lot of research that shows that this is what works for behavior. Also, when we are disciplining, we don't tend to be calm and happy people, right? As adults, when we get to discipline, we're usually pretty ticked off. So if we think about the social and emotional radar in Down syndrome, being frustrated and upset is not really a good fit, right? So if we want our discipline to be effective and thoughtful and to prevent future negative behaviors, being upset when we do it is probably not a great idea. When we're upset, of course, we're making a lot of facial expressions, we're using a strong tone of voice, and all of these things can be really reinforcing. But discipline is really also pretty simple. It comes back to the basics of behavior. You reinforce what you want to see more of, and you don't reinforce what you want to go away. So for reinforcement, for good behaviors that we want to see more of, we focus on adding, right? We add something, we add attention, we add a reward. For discipline, we focus on taking things away, right? So the first thing that we want to take away, specifically for people with Down syndrome, is the social, right? If we see a behavior that we don't like, we shouldn't be making a lot of eye contact, right? Eye contact is a really powerful thing. You can try this at home when a child is acting out or in school, doing a really negative behavior that seems to be attention-seeking. A lot of times they'll be, I'm going to do this, looking right at you, right? If you turn your body and do not show any interest, you'll be amazed at how powerful it is in stopping that behavior and preventing it from recurring. We don't want to use a lot of language, right? That's not going to be so effective. I just realized a typo. Sorry about that. We don't want to yell or use a strong tone of voice. And we don't want to make strong facial expressions, right? All of those aspects of body language are going to be reinforcing the very behavior we're trying to get rid of. We have to be really aware of that social emotional radar. Again, like I was talking about earlier, we can manage a lot of behaviors just by our body language. So we want to be really careful that when we see negative stuff, we're not inadvertently reinforcing it by getting really worked up. Does that make sense? We have to be careful because even when we stop ourselves from yelling, and even when we stop ourselves from really freaking out, our faces can say a lot, right? Does anyone remember this from the Olympics? This was the figure skater who was not so happy with her score, right? And in her interview, she said, "Oh no, it was fair, it was fine," but the picture said, told a different story. So we have to be really, really careful what message we are sending. It takes some practice, but after some time, you get really good at just going completely blank when you see negative behaviors, and then really turning it on and being very emotive and expressive when you see good behaviors. When you do have to intervene, and you do have to respond, I would ask you to think about all you've learned, and you want to be careful that you're responding, but you're not reacting, right? Reacting would imply you're getting emotional, you're getting upset, you're doing that knee-jerk, instinctual, this kid's trying to drive me crazy, therefore I'm going to bear down and, make this next hour awful because I feel awful, right? We know that that's not very effective. So we're going to take away facial expressions and eye contact. We can also take the child out of the situation, right? Time out is just removing all of the reinforcers, right? Often involving removing the child. When kids are big or there are more complicated factors, we can remove the other people, right? We just want to end the reinforcement in whatever way we can. We can remove objects, right? So, for example, I had another child that was hitting the dog. Every time there was a new puppy in the house, every time he saw the puppy, he was whacking the puppy. His parents couldn't figure it out. They were giving him time out. They were yelling at him. They were talking to him. Of course, none of that was effective. Eventually, we said, you know what? He whacks the dog. He only gets to play with the dog with supervision. He whacks the dog goes away. He learned really, really quickly, you don't whack the dog, right? Because he wanted to play with the dog. So soon, he was able to play with the dog for a longer period. His parents were showing him, this is how you interact with the dog. When he messed up and forgot and whacked the dog, no dog, right? You learn very, very quickly. So we don't need to yell. We don't need to get upset. None of those are going to be effective. We don't need to make lots of eye contact. We don't need to give time out. We just need to think about what is the reinforcer here and take it away. So we've covered a lot of ground. I think that these strategies do tend to get people pretty far if you can carry them out and be consistent. But there are times that people need more help, of course. So Professionals can certainly be of help. A lot of school systems in the US, this is true, I assume it's similar, that through the schools you can receive a functional behavior assessment. Is that true in British Columbia? Okay, great. I thought so, but I don't want to make assumptions. And that's a really thorough analysis of your child's behavior. Typically, we want it to be done at home, at school, and in the community, so that you can kind of see like what is causing the behavior in different settings. Is it different? Is it certain interactions or certain stimuli, certain times of day? And you come up with a behavior plan based on your child's specific profile and needs. There also could be other things going on. There is unfortunately a high rate of medical problems, pain, all sorts of other things that individuals with Down syndrome sometimes do not have the ability to communicate how they feel very specifically, and therefore things can be coming out behaviorally. It could also be things like sleep apnea, thyroid issues, as was mentioned earlier. At times, and a lot of the time in our practice, we do neuropsych testing to try and figure out, is there something else going on, right? Is there ADHD or a disruptive behavior disorder, or on and on and on. The list goes on. Just like any other group of people, there are all sorts of other things that can be going on in addition to Down syndrome. It was an old idea that if there was Down syndrome as part of the picture, there couldn't be anything else. And now we know that that's really not true. If there is another condition, obviously we want to make sure that it's treated. So medical disorders and psychiatric disorders, right? This is all, again, relatively new, not in the last year, but the last couple of decades that people are really considering. How do you deal with all these complex conditions that people with Down syndrome can face in addition to what we know about their, trisomy? Okay. So there are a lot of physicians that know about Down syndrome, so neurologists, developmental pediatricians, psychiatrists, people who have specific training. There are Down syndrome programs all around North America through the National Down Syndrome Congress and the National Down Syndrome Society. There are resources. George Capone, who's here somewhere, is one of the founders and leaders of the Down Syndrome Medical Interest Group. And so there are lots of resources out there. Again, as I mentioned, through the school and sometimes through health plans, you can receive functional behavior assessments, sometimes applied behavior analysis. There are some books. There is not currently a book about behavior in Down syndrome, but that is forthcoming. There is not one right now. These are a couple of books that are just really good for like nuts and bolts. How does behavior work? So to close, when we're dealing with behavior for any kid, we really have to consider how that person sees the world and experiences it. And that'll make our behavior interventions much, much more effective. In my opinion, when we're working with people with Down syndrome, I think we're like way, way ahead of the game because we know a lot about what that extra chromosome does in the brain. So I think we have kind of a head start, which I think is really empowering and helpful. We know what strategies are likely to work. This is just a really cute kid. So I encourage you to remember to focus on your relationship and the positive and the strengths of your child, and that'll help you pick the best behavior strategies. The goal, again, as I said right at the outset, is not perfection. It's not going to happen, just like any other aspect of life. It's just to see improvement and go a little easy on yourselves and your partners because it is not easy work. So encourage each other, support each other, take breaks. The end point of all this is not tomorrow or 6 months from now. It's really adulthood, right? As I see it, it's that I want all of your kids, adolescents, young adults, to get to adulthood and have behavior not get in the way of all the other good things that they could be doing. So I just want to say thanks to Pat and to the foundation and to Don, to my team at Children's in Boston, and then especially to all the kids and families, because I really love my work. It's really fun, and thanks for having me.